interesting too. So anyways, all those things seem to chunk together. Now the industrious people also seem to want to climb up the hierarchy, right? Because you know that industrious people become more successful as they move through life. And so you think, well, that's sort of a motivation. But then you might ask, is the industrious person trying to get to the top, or is the industrious person trying to get the hell away from the bottom? And my suspicions are that the industrious person is trying like hell to get away from the bottom. They don't want to be down there with the, you know, like I said, the unemployed and the great unwashed. And now why? Well, here's a bunch of reasons. First of all, we know pretty clearly that if you're in a dominance hierarchy, the closer you are to the bottom of the hierarchy, the more likely you are to die. So, and that's independent of absolute income. Like obviously if you're poor enough, that's going to make a difference because you're going to starve to death. But assuming you have enough money to take care of your basic needs, then dominance hierarchy position is a big determinant of mortality, even in heart disease and more. If you look at songbirds or any other kind of animal that lives in the dominance hierarchy, and that's pretty much the case for all animals. So imagine you have a dominance hierarchy of songbirds in your neighborhood. And the high dominant songbirds, so they're maybe the industrious songbirds, they get the best nest. And then you think, well, what does the best nest mean? Well, it's close to nesting material, so they don't have to like exert a lot of energy building the nest. And it's dry when it rains, so that's a good thing because then their eggs don't get wet and get cold. And there aren't a lot of predators lurking around, and it's well hidden and it's well ventilated. Like there's a bunch of things that make an optimal nesting site really useful. So there's a bunch of birds, and some of them have great nesting sites, and some of them have like, you know, slum nesting sites, and then some kind of epidemic comes through. Guess what happens? The birds die from the bottom of the hierarchy upwards. Well, why? Well, because the ones at the bottom are chronically stressed. And stress shuts off your immune system. And so it's like, poof, epidemic comes through, dead. And so one of the things that may well have been built into human beings as the biological basis of industriousness is the desire to get the hell away from the bottom of a dominance hierarchy as fast as possible. Because you're much more likely to die if you're down there. And you know, we know that your trait preferences have emerged as a consequence of evolutionary pressure. And if the bottom of the dominance hierarchy happens to be the place where disease is rife, which is exactly how it is, then of course you should be motivated to get the hell out of there. And so I think a lot of the class distinctions that people draw and their desire to have markers of status and so on are a reflection of their high motivation to be associated with the high levels of the economic classes. Here's something interesting, for example. You know that names go down the dominance hierarchy. You know, so what are you going to name your children? Well, the originator of names are the people at the top of the dominance hierarchy. And you know, and then once they establish the names, then the next group starts to copy them, and then the next group copies them, and then by the time the name gets common at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy, the people at the top are no longer using it. They've got some other names figured out. And so names get not only generated that way, but also recycled that way. So, and you never want to underestimate the motivation of people to not be at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy. And so it's kind of the reverse of achievement motivation, right? It's sort of like getting away. But if conscientiousness is mostly associated with these kind of negative emotions, guilt, shame, and disgust, then those are all getting away from emotions. Those aren't, oh, it's good to go that way emotions, but those would be more associated with extroversion and openness. So when conscientious people seem to be dutiful, so they're not doing things because they're interested in them. In fact, they would say, who the hell cares if you're interested in it? Do it anyways. That's what a good citizen does. And of course, there's some truth in that, right? You do your damn duty. So, okay, so you kind of get the sense of how conscientiousness is structured. Now, that's often been called a behavioral immune system. So the other thing we know about orderly people and conservatives is they're anti-immigration, as I said, and they're xenophobic, so they're much more pro-in-group, and they're quite harshly judgmental in their attitudes towards non-standard sexual behavior. And you can explain that all in terms of contamination fear. And so, and you might think too, you know, like, you know what happened to the Native Americans when the Europeans showed up, eh? Because the Europeans, they lived in these like filthy, filthy cities. They were just crammed together. And they lived with their animals too. So like they were parasite-ridden and they had all sorts of diseases. But they got good immune systems functioning as a consequence of that. And over, you know, a long period of time, they developed immunity to things that would have otherwise killed them, like well, chicken pox and measles and that sort of thing. So the Europeans came over to North America and they shook hands with the natives. It was like, poof, 95% of them died in the next 50 years. So it was like by the time the settlers came to Plymouth Rock, you know, the pilgrims, there were so few Native Americans left that they were happy to see them because they couldn't get their damn crops off. There weren't enough people left. So part of the reason that North America looked empty when the Europeans showed up is because 3 successive waves of absolutely catastrophic plagues had decimated the entire population of the continent. You know, and the same thing still happens when in places like Brazil and Peru, when they find isolated native groups in the jungle. Because, you know, that still happens now and then. It's like, oh, look, some natives. Shake their hand, poof, they're all dead in like a year. So the idea that the foreign person is a danger has been like critically correct for much of human developmental history, and that's a real problem, right? Because obviously in the modern world, we better get along with everybody because, of course, we're all powerful enough to wipe each other out. But, you know, the problem is you might think about things like xenophobia, you know, preference for your own group, and out-group prejudice and that kind of thing as like a cognitive issue. Well, you could just sort it out if you thought properly. But all this research indicates it's a lot worse than that in some sense, because it's grounded in something much deeper. And not only is it grounded in something much deeper, it seems to be grounded in something that's necessary. Right? If you're not disgust sensitive, well, then your hygiene habits aren't very good. Well, then you get sick more. Plus, you don't work as hard. Then your life isn't as good. You know, so it's another one of those examples where the virtue is and where the vice is. It's a very, very difficult thing to tell. So